Now, are we days or at most a couple of weeks from a huge shift in the country's legal acceptance of same-sex marriage? The Supreme Court's decision in The Supreme Court's decision in Obergudfell versus Hodges is looming over a landscape that's been shifting very rapidly, and depending on the outcome, it will either speed up the march toward national legalization or put a pretty big roadblock in its way.
Here to talk about the implications and to tell us how we got here are two people long involved in the fight for marriage equality. Susan Sommer, as Director of Constitutional Litigation for Lambda Legal, is a key member of the team representing 9 of the plaintiffs in the challenge. Welcome. And Professor Art Leonard of New York Law School has written, organized, and taught about LGBTQ rights for more than 30 years. All right. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So we know that we're about to have a big shift here, one way or the other, but just to sort of frame it, when we're in a position where workplace discrimination is still rampant, and even safety of some LGBTQ people in a city like New York is at risk, why is marriage the centerpiece of this movement at the moment?
Well, marriage isn't necessarily the centerpiece of the movement, but we are at a very pivotal and dramatic moment when it comes to marriage, because we do have this very critical Supreme Court case. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been, as we speak and going forward, a tremendous amount of work on issues like employment discrimination, prisoner rights, rights of transgender people. The media, you and others, are very interested in marriage right now. But believe me, Lambda Legal and many others are hard at work on all these other questions.
So 30 years later, then, why such a central spot for marriage?
Well, I think people wanted it. You know, it's really interesting to see how this came up. Back in the early days of the gay rights movement, marriage was always on that list of demands. You go back to the 1950s and the very, very early pre-Stonewall gay rights movement, they had their manifesto, their list of demands, and marriage was always on there. But no one thought that it would be a reality for generations. But the real big push on marriage came with the AIDS epidemic and with the phenomenon of gay people raising kids. And marriage is like crucially important when you're raising kids in terms of legal relationships and rights to benefits and authority to consent to medical care and things of that sort, and deal with schools. So as more and more same-sex couples were raising kids together, and as the AIDS epidemic was putting a lot of pressure on gay families in the 1980s, there's this big swell of demand in the community for marriage, and the LGBT rights groups were even reluctant to take it up because they said, first we got to get rid of sodomy laws and we got to take care of employment discrimination. Right. But the community wanted it, and the first few cases were actually filed by individuals, not by the gay legal organizations, because the gay legal organizations are saying, wait, we've got to do these other things. We can't get marriage until we get rid of sodomy laws. And in fact, that proved to be true because the first case that we really won on marriage in Massachusetts came just months after the Supreme Court declared sodomy laws unconstitutional. So we had to get that out of the landscape first, and then marriage became very central at that point.
Very cogent point. So, Susan, can you tell us about Henry v. Hodges and how it fits into the case before the Supreme Court right now to sort of bring it all up to date and into context?
Sure. The Supreme Court is actually deciding 6 cases at once, and they come from 4 different states. States that are within what's called the Sixth Circuit, the federal circuit court, appellate court that covers Michigan. So there's a case from Michigan. Tennessee, there's a case from Tennessee. 2 from Kentucky and 2 from Ohio, and Henry is one of them. And together, these cases present to the court the question whether same-sex couples have a constitutional right to marry in their home states, and also whether, if they've already married elsewhere, do they have a constitutional right to have their marriages respected everywhere? And Henry is a case that Lambda Legal is co-counseling on, and that is seeking recognition of out-of-state marriages by the state of Ohio. And we actually have clients in that case, plaintiffs in that case, who are New Yorkers. There's a New York couple, 2 men. They married in New York. New York, thank goodness, has the freedom to marry and has for several years now. This is a long-standing couple, married as soon as they could. Then they adopted a beautiful baby boy.
In Ohio.
He was born in Ohio,
Yeah.
but he was adopted here in New York. Again, New York lets same-sex couples adopt together. It has broken through those barriers, but Ohio still has a barrier to adoption by what they consider to be an unmarried couple, and since they won't recognize our client's marriage, the Vitale-Talmas family's marriage, they won't recognize the adoption as being consistent with their public policy. So our clients went back to Ohio after they adopted their child and said, well, now we want what's routine for you to update his birth certificate and put our names on. This happens all the time after an adoption. And the state said, no, only one of you can be on this boy's birth certificate, not both. So one of the issues before the Supreme Court is whether their marriage is entitled to recognition. One of the very important things that flow from that is recognition of their parentage of this child and the ability to have something as simple as an accurate birth certificate for him. There are other couples in that case as well. Ohio couple, two couples from Kentucky who live right over the border, commute every day into Ohio. All of those families had their children in Ohio hospitals. And in so many ways, when a state doesn't let you marry or recognize your marriage, it withholds from you and your family protections around parenting, around inheritance, around the ability to take care of each other in a time of crisis, the ability to be there for one another in a hospital, many other things. And that's all rolled together in what the Supreme Court is deciding now.
Or even something as vital as getting your child admitted into a hospital if you're not the parent of record on that birth certificate has happened, right?
That's right.
So looking at this, Professor, America, 50 states. We have some patchwork of ideas and laws in some states that don't fly in others. Is there another instance where something as basic as what seems like a civil right to most of us in America is denied on this basis? Because there's gun laws in states that don't match, but not as much as civil rights laws.
Well, there are a lot of ways that states differ. In qualifications to be a driver, for example, in gun laws, as you pointed out, in the practice of licensed professions. Someone who's licensed as a lawyer in New York, they can't just go to Ohio and practice law. They have to be admitted by the courts. So there are many ways in which we have local control of things. And marriage has traditionally been a matter of local control. But the Supreme Court has, on occasion, said that there are certain constitutional interests involved that supersede the state's ability. And several of those cases are the key cases that we're building on in these same-sex marriage cases. For example, Virginia was one of many states still in the 1960s that didn't allow interracial marriages. Right. And the Supreme Court said, well, that violates the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which protects our liberty and our equality rights. And the Supreme Court now is going to be looking at those same two constitutional rights, equality and liberty, and asking whether it applies to same-sex couples in the same way.
Okay. Interesting. Now, Susan, I have to ask you, especially after everything you just told us, if the decision came down today and it was good news for supporters of same-sex marriage, what would change for your clients?
First of all, they would be able to get accurate birth certificates for their children, listing both of them. And they would also, particularly the clients who live in states that haven't recognized their marriages at all, have hundreds, if not thousands, of rights. They would be able to go to hospitals and be recognized as spouses in emergencies, inherit from one another, file their taxes as a married couple jointly. And they would also be freed from the terrible stigma and indignity of being branded in states around this country as essentially unmarriageable, as having a family that means less, counts less. They'll be able to tell their children, your parents are married. If that may not be what everybody wants or right for every family, but families should have that option and nobody should be cut out from it. And it'll also, besides my clients, mean that around the country, thousands of same-sex couples will be able to get married in their home states. Right now, 14 states are not allowing same-sex couples to marry, which is a terrible indignity to families in those states, makes them far less secure when what they really want is to be married to one another.
So if we're in a place now in 2015 where we're debating the merits of same-sex marriage, it seems, I guess from the early days, I've always thought of this as a contractual issue. If separation of church and state is sort of a cornerstone of this whole American experiment, and marriage is a contract between two folks recognized by a state, how is it so mixed up in all of these issues of morality or religion if two adults who could enter into any other contract together can't have one that's sanctioned by the state?
Yeah, well, the history of marriage in the United States is rather complicated. And in many places, many times, marriage has been conceived as primarily a religious affiliation, a covenant, a sacrament. And the state really didn't get involved on the level of legislation on marriage until well into the 19th century. We had what is called in this country common law marriage, where a couple would just live together and hold themselves out as being a couple, as being married, and eventually they were together a certain amount of time. The law would just recognize that. There was no formalities involved unless they wanted to go to a church to get married. And the idea of government issuing licenses to get married is a later development. And in fact, common law marriage wasn't even abolished in most states until early in the 20th century. I think in New York it was in the 1930s that they passed a statute abolishing common law marriage and said, if you want to get married, have to get a license from the state. And religious authorities could be authorized to perform the ceremony and to give whatever religious significance there is for the particular couple that wants to get married, but they had to be authorized by the state to do it for purposes of the government recognizing it. It's a rather complicated, multi-layered system now. Yeah. And many people still carry around a view in their own minds that marriage has a religious aspect to it, and I think people who have that view of marriage tend to be the most resistant to the idea of a purely civil marriage between same-sex couples. But what this lawsuit is about is civil marriage. And it is a contract of a sort, but it's also a status recognized by the state which entitles you to all kinds of rights and benefits and imposes obligations for support.
And no religious authorities would be compelled to perform a marriage. It was outlined in some of the first question, I think, that came up to say we would never, nor have we ever said that someone who has a religious background, you can't have your gay wedding in a Catholic church if they object to it.
Exactly, and I think that's a really important point that people should not lose sight of. Religious denominations and clergy will remain free to make those decisions for themselves, whether to perform marriages, just as they've been with respect to other kinds of marriages. This case is not about, and this issue is not about addressing those religious issues. This is about civil marriage that Professor Leonard was speaking of, about this special state-conferred status that carries with it thousands of legal rights and benefits.
But one thing that we should emphasize is that religious bodies that want to perform same-sex marriages are totally free to do so. In fact, they're free to do so in states that now prohibit same-sex marriage. The problem is, if they do it in that state, it will have only religious significance and no legal significance.
Instead of those rights that are afforded.
I think we're getting down to about 30 seconds. Do you have a prediction for us, possibly?
Yeah, I predict that we'll win, and it's simple Supreme Court arithmetic. It's you need 5 votes to win. You need 4 votes to grant review of a case. Last October, they turned down 3 cases from other federal circuits where we had won below. And since then, they have never agreed to stay a new marriage ruling, even from states where the circuit court hasn't made a decision yet. The 11th Circuit, they've refused to stay in Florida and Alabama. So I think there's a majority on the Supreme Court. I think the Supreme Court arithmetic is pretty clear here. they don't come out with a marriage ruling, it will cause quite a bit of chaos around the country.
Well, then if they do and it doesn't go your way, Susan, what are the ramifications for that?
Well, I want to throw some salt over my shoulder right now. We sure hope that we will win, but if we don't, we will shed some tears and be horribly disappointed, but we will pull ourselves together and we will take the fight to state by state to win the right to marry in the political process.
Thank you so much. We appreciate
Thank you.
being here.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
having us.